Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to part 2 of my ES2 synthesizer tutorial series in Logic Pro 9. In the previous video, we took a look at the oscillators and the tuning options, as well as the global parameters for the ES2. In this video, we'll be taking a look at the filter options and the built-in effects unit that comes with the ES2. Alright, so the ES2 is called a hybrid synth, probably because it's both an additive synth. You can layer or sum multiple oscillators together. It's also a subtractive synth because it has a filter that allows us to scoop out frequencies. And it also has some FM options, which we haven't talked about yet, both in oscillator 1 and both in the filter, filter number 2. So we haven't quite talked about those yet. And it's also a ring modulator synthesizer, so it allows us to apply ring modulation between oscillator 2 and 1. So it's got a little bit of everything in it. So in this video, we'll be taking a look at, yes, the FM options, the filter, as well as the effects unit. All right, so let's take a look at the ES2's filters. The ES2 has two filters. One of them is right here, and the other one is right here. Now, this entire filter wheel here contains both filters. And to turn on your filters, you click on the filter button. As long as it's highlighted, it's on. And you can also run the filters in two different ways. You can run it in parallel, which is the way it is right now. And what parallel does is it takes the output of the three oscillators, sums them together, or then splits them into two separate channels, one that goes to filter 1, another that goes to filter 2, and on the opposite side of the filter, they are joined back together. You can also run it, if you click here where it says parallel, you can run it in series, which means that the signal from the oscillators goes into filter 1, then goes into filter 2, then goes to the output of the filter. You can also adjust the blend of the two filters here. So if you want all filter 1 and you don't want to use filter 2, you just push the blend knob all the way to the left or all the way to the right for filter 2. I'm going to put this back in parallel, just it's a little easier to look at that way. And I'm going to put the blend all the way up to filter 1. Now filter 1 has three knobs. You have a cut, RES, and drive. The basic premise of a filter is that it is a module or a signal processor that attenuates or cuts a signal at a certain area. So the cutoff frequency, which is the cut knob, is the frequency where the signal has already been attenuated, cut, by 3 decibels. So this is going to adjust where we are cutting the signal. And it also depends on what type of filter you are using. The filter number 1 has 5 different types of filters we can choose from. We have low pass, high pass, peak, band reject, and band pass. Now, a low pass filter, essentially the word pass means allow. So if we have a low pass filter, we have a filter that is attenuating, cutting high frequencies, but allowing low frequencies. With a high-pass filter, we're allowing highs, but cutting lows. With band pass, we're allowing a band of middle frequencies through while cutting highs and lows. And band reject, also known as a band stop filter, does the inverse of what the band pass does. It cuts middle frequencies, but allows highs and lows. Now, the middle option here, peak, is a peak filter, and essentially a peak filter works in a lot of the same ways as like just a frequency band does in an equalizer. It's not quite a filter per se because it actually doesn't cut any frequencies. What the peak filter does is it actually boosts frequencies at the cutoff frequency. So as you move this around, you're boosting a band of frequencies up rather than cutting them down. So I'm going to go with a low pass for this one. The low pass is probably the most commonly used type of filter in synthesizers, mostly because it allows you to take really harmonically rich sounds like the sawtooth waveform and attenuate some of the upper frequencies to make the sound a lot warmer. So I'm going to turn the filter off just for a moment, and this is what we had in the previous video. This is the last patch that we ended up with. So that's the patch that we created before. And as I turn on our filter here, and as I move my cutoff around, you'll find as I move it to the left, we're attenuating more and more highs. And as I move it to the right, we're attenuating less and less highs. So you can kind of find a happy medium in between all the way up, or all the way off, and all the way on. And you can kind of scoop out whatever upper frequencies that you want. And the same thing goes for high pass, except it's in the opposite direction now. With high pass all the way to the right, the filter is taking a harder effect. And as we move to the left, when we move to the left, we're not attenuating as many of the low frequencies. Here's just the peak filter. Very subtle effect. The band reject filter, and then the band pass filter. So I'm going to stick with the low pass and put it about right there. All right, another really common element within most filters is resonance. And essentially what resonance is it's feedback. If you think about the analog synthesis world, within analog synthesizers, you'll have what's called a VCF, a voltage-controlled filter. And what a voltage-controlled filter does is it feeds back the signal at the cutoff frequency to boost. What it can do is it can feed back the cutoff frequency back into itself over and over again to create a boost in frequencies right at the cutoff frequency. So basically, it ends up looking like a boost just before the cut. And that's what resonance is. It's that feedback that is a feedback of the signal right at the cutoff frequency. So as I raise this, you're going to hear this peak of signal rise, almost creating a very tinny, high-end, shrill effect. Here's an upper, a little bit higher note. Now, depending on how you use your resonance, it can kind of create kind of a froggy effect. In the mid-range. In the high range, it's more of like a shrieky sound. So that's your resonance. And then the drive knob acts kind of just like a filter drive. It's almost like a almost like a tube saturation effect. It's almost like a I don't really want to say distortion, but a gain effect. So if you just want the sound to be a little beefier, a little more beefier, you can pull that up. I'll pull it up just a little bit. Now let's go down to filter 2 just for a moment. Filter 2 is a dedicated low-pass filter. You'll notice that you can't choose what type of filter you want. What you can choose instead is you can choose 12 dB, I believe that says 18 dB, and 24 dB. This is the roll-off slope of the cutoff frequency for the low-pass filter. Essentially what it means is the amount of attenuation per octave that we have. So if you have a 12 dB per octave cut, you have a more gradual slope than you would have with a 24 decibel per octave cut. So it basically is just determining how steep is the roll-off slope. The fat button basically just gives the filter a low emphasis boost, just basically reinforcing the bass. So I'm going to keep that on. The cutoff frequency and the resonance work basically the same way as they do in filter 1. And there's also this little FM knob, which, well, let's go ahead and describe that now. But basically what the FM knob does is the cutoff frequency of filter 2, this right here, can be modulated by oscillator number 1. Now, the basic premise of FM synthesis is that you have the signal of one oscillator running into the signal of another oscillator. And the first one in the chain affects the signal of the second one in the chain. So depending on the frequency of oscillator number 1, we're going to get a different effect from this. And this FM knob is essentially defining the intensity of that modulation. Now, typically when you when you use this, basically what's happening is you're feeding the signal of oscillator number 1 into a sine wave that is equal to the cutoff of filter 2. So here's the effect that you get from this. And I think partly that's being exacerbated even more by the fact that we're in legato unison mode. So let's put ourselves in polyphonic. I guess now we're just going to get that beating effect either way. So that's just what the FM knob there does. So that's our filters. And again, you can blend the two together. So for instance, if I want filter 1 to be a high pass and I want filter 2 to be a low pass, I can certainly do that. The only issue with using a high pass and a low pass is that if you have the cutoffs set in a certain way, you can actually completely negate your signal. So you have to be very careful about how you use a low pass and a high pass together to create a composite sound. So let's bump all this up here. Let's put ourselves back in legato. Let's see what this sounds like. Now, one of the problems of using a high pass filter, even though we're kind of blending the low pass and the high pass together, one of the common problems of using a high pass filter is you lose your fundamental low frequencies. So on the right side of the filter, we have this sine level. And essentially what sine level is, it's an additional fourth oscillator that basically adds a sine wave at the frequency of, I believe, oscillator number 1. So it adds this extra sine wave to go back and basically it's the only post filter oscillator that allows you to kind of reintroduce bass if that bass had been cut out by a high pass filter. So let's see what that sounds like. And so it's just adding a sine wave at the frequency of oscillator number 1. Above the sine level knob, this is a knob that we've used quite often. Even in the previous video, I didn't formally introduce it, but this is the master volume control for the entire synthesizer. And I've been tweaking that all along. All right. To the right of that is our effects unit. And one of the really common things that is confusing about the ES2 is that there's this little XY pad surrounded by this circle of 4 knobs, and you immediately assume that the XY pad has something to do with these 4 knobs. It doesn't. The XY pad we'll come back to later. It can be used as a modulation source. It can also be used at the vector envelope, which we'll talk about in a later video. But right now, these effects have nothing to do with the XY pad, so it's kind of tricky. It looks like that the XY pad is controlling these effects, but it's not. So basically, up top we have a distortion saturation unit, and on the bottom we have just a flanger phaser chorus effects unit. So if we want to add a little bit of phaser, we can do that. Let me turn the volume down a little bit. And then if we want to hear the phaser, we have to bump up the intensity. So that's essentially the depth of that effect, or the amount of the effect. And the speed is just how fast the effect is happening. We can do this with a flanger or a chorus effect. So that's that. Above that, we have a distortion unit. We have 2 modes, hard and soft. Soft tends to sound more like a tube saturation effect, and hard sounds more like almost like a stomp box sort of distortion effect. So here's a hard, and again, the distortion knob is the amount of distortion we're hearing. And then here's soft. And the tone knob is essentially the higher low frequency emphasis of the distortion. So if you want it to be a very warm distortion effect, you'd pull it to dark. A bright high emphasis, you'd turn it to the left or to the right. Just use a little hair of that and a little bit of flanger too. I'm just going to pull our voices down. There we go. Get a nice dirty sound there. So, two last things that I haven't gone over yet on the upper part of the ES2. The first is this little button above the effects unit that says Filter Reset. In analog synthesizers, a VCF your voltage controlled filter can actually self-oscillate if you increase the resonance high enough. Because basically what happens with resonance is as you increase the feedback at the cutoff frequency, the floor noise will actually begin to trigger the filter to self-oscillate. So with the filter reset button on, it triggers, I believe it's filter number 2, to self-oscillate as you bump up the resonance knob. Let me turn off some of these. Let's turn off our effects. Yeah, hear that real high sound there? So we can get these really nice resonance sweeps. And one interesting thing is even if we turn off all 3 oscillators and the sine level, with filter reset on, filter number 2 will actually self-oscillate a sine wave. Even though there is no oscillators on, and you can control that. And it doesn't sound like a sine wave because I've got a bunch of tuning issues going on and other things going on. The unison's on as well. But if I use the cutoff knob and pull that around, that it's actually controlling the pitch of our resonance feedback. And that can be used for a number of effects. And then one last thing to wrap up this video. Actually, I do need that on. That I didn't show you in the previous video, which I should have, was this FM option in oscillator number 1. Now, earlier we talked about FM synthesis as a type of synthesis where you have one oscillator being fed into another oscillator, and so the first one changes the tone of the second one. In this case, when you set oscillator number 1 to a sine wave and bump the depth up, what you're doing is you are sending the signal of oscillator 1. Actually, I take it back. You're sending the signal of oscillator 2 into oscillator number 1 rather than being run in parallel. So if we adjust this up towards the FM option, basically we're adjusting the depth of how much of oscillator 2 is going into oscillator 1. And so what we get is some classic sounding FM effects. As you change the tuning of oscillator 2, we don't really hear it as a pitch shift, but rather a timbral change, much like we did when we used the sync option and the ring modulation option in the previous video. All right, so I hope you enjoyed the video. In the next part of the series, we will discuss the modulation routers. We'll also discuss LFOs, and if we get to it, we'll also discuss the envelopes and how to take our core oscillator sound up here with just oscillators and effects and the filter and be able to create some cool repeating effects and envelope effects like filter sweeps and vibrato and stutter effects and things like that. So In the next video, we'll cover pretty much everything down here, as well as the modulation routers. And I think in part 4, I'll wrap up a few loose ends with the vector envelope and the XY pad and the side chain menu up here as well. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for part 3.